Since the 1970s, Boston exam schools have been a place of conflict, often pitting the virtues of inclusion and equity against metrics for educational excellence. Many people in Boston believe it's possible to have excellence with inclusion. One version of that was recently approved by a task force on exam school admissions policy, but a last-minute change in the policy, increasing the odds of admission for students with high test scores, has drawn objections from groups working together as the Boston Coalition for Education Equity. To explain that position is one of the members, Lisa Green. Thank you very much for being with us, Lisa.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Lisa, what about that last minute change? Because it seems the rest of the policy was a giant step toward more inclusion. So how did the 20% or so in that last minute change really upset the balance so much?
Sure. So the task force ran a 4-month process, very public, very transparent, subject to open meeting laws. And they met with experts from, scholars to public officials in other districts. They also reviewed a ton of data. They reviewed real admissions data from the past, and they reviewed simulations that BPS was able to run on the various scenarios that they had. And one thing was unequivocal. When you looked at that 20% citywide competition for that 20% of seats, it disproportionately favored whiter, wealthier families. And so that went directly against the charge of the task force, which was to increase diversity while maintaining rigor. And so the task force had agreed to eliminate that provision. And towards the end of the meeting, where they had made that agreement, they had a break and came back after the break and recessed the meeting rather than adjourned it. They continued the meeting the next day, and the co-chairs said that they had gotten a lot of public pushback on removing the 20%, and that they thought that it was best to include the 20% provision, because if not, and Mr. Contapasis couldn't really say what had happened. He said, I'm giving you as much information as I can, but there'll be, consequences that none of us would like to see for the students at BPS. And the task force members were very confused and indignant in that meeting. They didn't understand why all of their 4 months of work had been pushed aside and who had been pushing it aside. So what had happened, oh, go ahead.
No, because what it sounds like here is that maybe there was a threat to hold up the school budget, which means it must have been coming from a majority of the city council, not just a couple of disaffected people. I mean, was there really that much objection, at least on the part of the council here?
Well, it sounds like that was the case, right? So to derail a budget for 53,000 students in BPS, a district that's majority Black and Latinx, coming out of a pandemic that disproportionately impacted Black and Latinx communities, to hold up that budget had to be pretty significant for those city councilors. But when you look at what the change would actually do, what that 20% is really about, and what the political pushback has always been really about, is Boston Latin School. So 20% of the seats at Boston Latin School would be 90 seats a year. So for 90 seats a year, for access to those seats for some whiter, more privileged families, these city councilors were willing to hold up the BPS budget for 53,000 students coming out of the worst year of their lives. It's astonishing.
Well, a lot of the new policy would involve socioeconomic tiers, students chosen from within those tiers. Now, at first, that sounds like the antithesis of merit, but unpack the tiers. How exactly would this work?
Yeah, and merit, also, the word merit is a very subjective term, right? We get to, the majority culture always gets to define what merit is. And we've done it for years, right? We created a system where merit was 50% of your score on a test that was for private school students not aligned with the BPS curriculum, and 50% grades, where we've seen evidence in the press and elsewhere that there are parochial schools that give the vast majority of their students an A+. So that definition of merit, that word merit, is very loaded in this conversation. But the SES tiers, right? The idea of the SES tiers, the socioeconomic tiers, is that you'd be competing with students with families, students who have families with similar means to yours, right? So So people with a lot of resources would compete against people with the same level of resources, and people with fewer resources would compete with people with comparable resources to them. And so those socioeconomic tiers are based on a number of factors. There's income, but there's also other factors about your neighborhood: English as a first language in the house, home ownership, right? If there's owner-occupied units, educational attainment level in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of things that go into it, and it's very similar to the model that we see in place in Chicago.
It's easy to understand that families with more money have a higher odds of cashing in on an exam. But what about the families that we heard from last fall at the school committee hearing on this policy? Because there were some families who were not very privileged, maybe Chinese immigrant families, who saw a long period of test preparation as the best bet for their kid to get into these exam schools. What about families like them? How would they fare under the policy approved by the task force?
Yeah, when you look at the simulations, the data on the 20% shows that it does not benefit those families, right? If you look at it by race or if you look at it by neighborhood, Asian families don't do better. Chinatown doesn't do better. A handful of white families in wealthier neighborhoods do better. So I think the benefit for this system is that even unlike the old system, those families in Chinatown will be competing with families of similar means to them. So I hope that will result in a fairer, a leveler playing field, right? So if everybody's competing with people of similar means, then those disparities shouldn't come up.
We're so used these days to talking about a trade-off between inclusion and excellence. But if you go back to maybe the 1990s, before racial set-asides at these exam schools were overturned by federal court, we must have had some more of at least inclusion. But what about excellence? Were we able to have excellence in those days with the inclusion?
Yeah, I think we were. Mr. Contempassis, who's one of the co-chairs of the task force, he had been headmaster at Boston Latin School. He's also been a superintendent. And in some of the legal filings that came up when families were suing to get rid of those set-asides, he shared data and he shared his opinion that rigor was absolutely preserved during that time. And I think we see, we benefit from leaders, not just in Boston, but across the country who came out of Boston Latin School during that period. There was no diminishment of rigor. And so we're looking forward to having rigor and having a more diverse community going forward.
I want to ask you about how diversity affects school climate, because you've been an active parent at Boston Latin School, and even in recent years under new leadership there, what was the sense, especially among students? How much difference did it make? Whether your population was minuscule or fairly large? What about the effect on students?
Yeah, well, it's hard being a teenager no matter where you are, right? And so if you can imagine a Black or Latinx teenager at Boston Latin School where there are almost no children who look like them, there are almost no students from their neighborhood. Boston Latin School, the old system produced a Boston Latin School that was around 40% parochial or private school every year, that was coming from a handful of neighborhoods. There's tons of kids from West Roxbury, ton from Charlestown, and that impacts the culture, right? It's a very different culture. And we've made great advances over the past 5-6 years since Ms. Scarrett's been there. The culture has shifted. People are willing to talk about race. People are making great strides in looking at the policies at our school and the climate at our school. But it's still hard with those numbers. It's hard to make an inclusive community when there are such tiny minorities of students. There's a student who was on the task force, Zoe Nagasawa. She had done a research study last year on the culture and the climate at Boston Latin School for students. And that sort of racial isolation is very harmful to students. Her study is really interesting to look at. And, you can see how it would harm, the old system would harm students who were placed in that sort of a minority at Boston Latin School. It harmed the kids who couldn't get in, who were coming from certain neighborhoods or certain racial demographic backgrounds, but it also hurts the students who are there, right? Both majority and minority. So, as a parent of white students, I want my kid to be in an environment that's more reflective of our community, right? We live in a world that's multicultural, that's diverse. So we want our children to be able to navigate those environments. And, to be in a school that doesn't look like our city or look like our culture, I think doesn't just harm the kids who don't get in, it harms the kids who do.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Chris. And if I could just say—
Oh, yes, you have a website because you get—
Yes, we have a website. So
yes.
If anybody is interested, we're trying to convince the school committee to vote on the task force's original 100% of seats distributed in socioeconomic tiers, that proposal. So go to our website, bossedequity.org. There's a petition you can sign. There are ways to contact your electeds and other ways to get involved.